Well, welcome to the Logistics Point interviews. We are joined by Rees Westley from BCS, and we're going to talk about power challenges in warehousing construction. So I just mentioned power challenges. Can we just try and summarize what are they when it comes to warehousing and developments and construction?
I think looking at power challenges holistically, not just at the logistics sector, I think at the moment we are in a period of change for sure. As we look at the logistics and warehousing market, it's probably somewhat similar to the data center markets that we also work in as well. Their geography is very, very important. So where these are established and constructed and built is obviously very, very important. So what we can't do always is move our developments nearer to the sources of the power. We've got a high number of sort of demand customers all looking for power in the same place. So the networks are thermally constrained at the moment. There's problems taking power from the networks. There's also problems putting power back into the networks as well. So generation is also a problem.
What do you think needs to change?
I think the way that we think about procuring power needs to fundamentally change. There's not an unlimited resource there. We can't expect to be making applications for power and that power just being there and being available. I think firstly, if we look at the national grid and we look at our local distribution service system operators, we need to be less reliant on those companies because the distribution network operators are constrained because they can't get power from our national grid. And our national grid is also in need of significant upgrades at the moment. Those upgrades are happening, but they're not happening near quick enough. If we look at West London, we look at the Midlands, we look at maybe up in the northeast of England, we're looking at extended periods whereby they are having to upgrade the transmission networks to be able to move power around. And as I touched on previously, that's not just affecting demand customers, so customers that are looking for power. It's also affecting generation companies in feeding that power back into the networks as well. I think we need to change the way that we strategy for taking power or bringing power into a development. If we look at the Prime Minister's security plan for power, it's very much looking at a decentralised power model. So what we're looking at is rather than decentralized generation feeding into the national grid networks and then coming back out again to be taken by demand customers, what we then start looking at is taking power directly from generation sources. So looking at things like solar, onshore wind, offshore wind, even then looking at things like microgrids. So we look at maybe a blend of renewable sources, which might be also supported with something like nuclear.
I wanted to bring you a bit more focus on what you mentioned as a microgrid, and I would assume this will be very local then for each individual facility, and it would also be easier to maintain probably and develop. But how easier is it to pay for it? As an initial investment.
So microgrids are very much reliant on an alignment with a number of different types of infrastructure. So when we talk about microgrids, we're looking at things like possibly nuclear as a baseline power. We're looking at things like renewable generation. So it could be wind, it could be solar, it could be hydro. We're also looking at fuels such as hydrogen now. So hydrogen can fuel things like standby generators and things like that. So, but our issue is it's not always sunny, especially in the UK. It's not always windy, and so what we can't do is we can't always rely on those renewable sources for a consistent power source. And so what we need is we almost need smart energy systems that can manage that power. When we start to look at microgridding, I think actually software and software management is going to be very, very important. So as you get to the end of a day and the sun starts to go down, your power source, which may have come predominantly from solar during the day, may then switch to wind. If the wind then drops, then we may need to then switch that power source over to somewhere else. So microgridding there'll be smart energy systems that will use the renewable energy when it could be used, but then it will default back into kind of baseline power of maybe a nuclear source or turbines when that renewable power is not available. We're factoring also maybe district heating networks as well. So where we might be harvesting heat from things like data centers, we might be using those to distribute around to housing estates or to local facilities. So there needs to be an alignment there. Those microgrids are going to be reliant on an alignment there, not between just the developer of the logistics facility, but actually also other local stakeholders as well.
What would be the first steps for you when you want to secure as an organization better energy and more energy, certainly to your facilities?
In logistics parks generally have expansive roof spacing, so solar is always a go-to. So solar is a good initial go-to for renewable power. These sites are often kind of outer urban, so we can consider onshore wind. Onshore wind is probably one of the cheapest ways of providing renewable energy. We can also look at battery storage strategies. So that's an option as well. So one of the options is to use battery storage during times where power is plentiful, and then using that potentially during the night when maybe the sun's not shining or you can't use your solar panels or it's not windy. One of the other things they're looking at the moment is also electrolysis plants. Areas where there is high wind, for instance, say if we're looking at onshore wind plants. So we've got a scenario at the moment where in Scotland we're generating a lot of renewable power, but we've got curtailment because the networks haven't got the capacity to be able to move that power. And so what they do is they end up switching those wind turbines off. What they're now looking at is things like electrolysis plants. So actually, rather than the curtailment, what they do is they use that energy to generate green hydrogen. And then green hydrogen can be used for things like standby generators, and it can be used in a range of scenarios as well for power. So there's a number of different things that we can look at. We touched on nuclear earlier. Nuclear is very much at the heart of the security strategy for the UK. I think we're going to see more modular reactors. We've got companies like Rolls-Royce at the moment who are developing smaller modular reactors, which are going to generate circa 400, 500 MVA of power. So I think they will be a go-to, but very much looking at a decentralized strategy. So moving away from direct connections into our national grid, moving away from direct connections into our DNOs, and actually looking at decentralized strategy.
When you're talking about decentralized strategy, how decentralized is this going to be each individual logistics hub, for example, or are we talking about a local authority, what you mentioned as well?
I think you've got local authorities, you've got private investors very, very interested in decentralized energy strategies now, or looking at development, decentralized development. What we had in the early days of solar, especially when we had the feed-in tariffs were very, very high. They've now been kind of withdrawn by the government now. When we were seeing feed-in tariffs of 45 pence per kilowatt, what was happening was there was a number of developers that were coming to the market to develop big solar farms because there was a good return on their investment. What's happening now is rather than them feeding back into the national grids, what they're now looking at doing is actually feeding demand centers directly from those facilities. So still building the solar farms, still building onshore, offshore wind, but rather than taking that power into the national network, they feed that directly to demand customers. So that is an option, and then they can sell power under a power purchase agreement or some kind of commercial arrangement. Yeah, decentralized, but actually circumventing our national grid network. I think another big shake-up in the industry. It's probably going to be one of the biggest changes that we've probably seen in the last couple of decades at least, is the introduction of independent transmission companies into the market. So we saw this probably 15, 10, 15, 20 years ago, where IDNOs were coming into the marketplace. So we had independent distribution network operators, which could actually construct and distribute electricity independently. We're now going to see probably an influx of independent transmission operators now who will move power around at transmission levels and make it much easier for kind of higher demand customers to be able to connect into the transmission network.
Rees, thank you very much for your time. And as usual, people watching can learn a bit more on what we spoke about in the description below. Thank you very much.